I'd like to thank Father Jim Greenfield for his homily today, which provided a perfect context for this conversion story. We're celebrating the conversion of St. Paul in the Catholic liturgy. So I have for you today a very interesting case of Salesian principles at work in the life of a married couple. I don't intend to lecture the St. Francis de Sales community on their patron saint, but a few notions for some who may not be acquainted with this saint. He lived in the 1600s. At an adolescent age of about 17, had a crisis of faith after hearing a discourse on predestination, and for 2 years was really shaken in his personal existence, even fell sick until he had finally resolved the crisis with trust in God's love, which would mark his teachings and ministry for the rest of his life. As a young priest, he was very zealous, known for his courage in evangelizing a section of the diocese that was Calvinist. And in those days, Calvinists and Catholics did not get along. He was eventually made bishop, and even as bishop was known for his gentleness, respect, his common sense way of discerning the will of God, for his courage. He was also known for his writing apostolate, writing several books, especially the Introduction to the Devout Life, thousands of letters, using tracts, very innovative evangelizer, until his sudden death at age 56, the day after suffering a massive stroke. During the lifetime of the Lesseurs, who I'll be talking about for 95% of this conference, he was declared Doctor of the Church. That's to say, one of the principal teachers of the faith and the first writer in French to be so named. His teachings are characterized by an emphasis in a wholehearted trust in the love of God. His charism is sometimes referred to as the way of divine love. Gentleness and humility were his characteristic virtues. He was known as the gentleman saint. The King of France, who would have liked to have him in his reign, said of him, "A strange bird, this Bishop of Geneva. He's devout and learned." Apparently there were many learned people that were not devout, and many devout people who were not learned. And he said, in addition, he's a gentleman. So this is the inspiration that I'd like to trace through the life of a French couple at the turn of the 20th century. But let me just read a few proverbs of his, or his writings. Gentleness, temperance, modesty, and humility are graces which ought to color everything we do. Gentleness, temperance, modesty, and humility. You can attract more flies with a spoonful of honey than a barrel of vinegar. And he wrote to a married woman in one of his numerous letters, "Be careful to put into practice humble sweetness which you owe to your husband and to everybody. It is the virtue of virtues which our Savior so often recommended. So let us enter into this conversion story. Elizabeth and Felix were a very happily married French couple in the late 19th and early 20th century. Felix's hopes of converting his wife were nearly accomplished, but the conversion he wanted for her was from Christianity to atheism. She had wanted to remain a Catholic, but after 7 years of married life, she stopped church going, suspended her participation in the sacraments, and there was just a tenuous thread that kept her with her Catholic identity. Her husband had been working on her for a long time, and she was beginning to give in to his arguments and perspective. At 30 years old, her childhood religious training must have been very inadequate to respond to the challenges her husband and his social circle offered to her. It seems she had no significant relationships with well-formed Catholics that could help her in a vulnerable situation in which she found herself. Felix awaited the right moment and then gave her a book to read that he figured would clinch her conversion. He gave her Ernest Renan's book, History of the Origins of Christianity. This tendentious series, claiming to be rigorous history, has a very non-Christian view of Christ, of the apostolic witness of the early church. He hoped that this would usher her into a state in which, like him, she would utter a sigh of relief to find herself finally freed from groveling subjection to Christian religious practices, beliefs, and institutions. But precisely the opposite occurred. What occurred was just the beginning, but a decisive one, of an even longer and much more delicate reverse process by which Felix himself would, very slowly and despite himself, be converted to Elizabeth's solidly founded faith and intense relationship with God. Just when Felix thought he was about to make her a disciple of his own intellectual brand of atheism, his very efforts provoked a salutary reaction in his wife. She sought to return to the practice of her faith, began to free herself from the web of his jaundiced thinking, and soon he found himself caught, as if in the power of a potent magnet, drawing him towards the God he did not believe in, who was active in his charming and ever-loving wife. But before we see the playing out of that reverse process that supplanted the conversion that Felix sought to orchestrate, let us see how it is that a couple that loved each other so dearly and were sacramentally married in the Catholic Church could come to be so deeply divided in matters of religion. How did a couple who committed themselves in marriage to love and respect each other all the days of their life find themselves in this predicament? For this, we have to go back to the beginning of their relationship. Elizabeth was born in Paris in 1866 to a wealthy French Catholic family. She was educated privately into her teens, receiving excellent training in languages, literature, and the fine arts, interests that would remain with her throughout her life. Her religious formation was most likely typical of the Catholic practice of her social class, something but not terribly important. When she met her future husband, when she was 20 and he 25, she had no inkling that he was not a practicing Catholic. He had been through Catholic educational system, as she had not. However, neither of them seemed to have been very concerned about the question. Otherwise, they would have had some frank conversations on the topic. She probably just presumed he was a Catholic like herself. It seems, too, that he became more stridently atheistic over time with his reading and his circle of friends. So perhaps during their 2 years of courtship, he was just agnostic or mildly atheistic. At the time they met, Felix was completing medical studies in Paris. He and Elizabeth shared many of the same interests: music, opera, literature, cultures, travel. And they were married in a Catholic wedding in 1889. But just before the wedding, I don't know whether it was a question of hours or days or weeks, she discovered that Felix was not only not a practicing Catholic, but was of atheistic persuasion. So she asked him to promise her never to be an obstacle to her practice of the faith. And he promised her and kept the promise for a few years. Then it seems his conviction that religion made no sense got the better of him, and he began to try to tear down her faith. His crusading zeal against the Catholic faith ate him up and provoked him to attack his wife's cherished beliefs. Note, it was not his intention to attack his wife, but rather her Christian faith. Yet even in the midst of acrimonious differences of religion, Elizabeth and Felix loved each other dearly, with a tender and intense affection. It seems that Felix considered it increasingly repulsive to accept that the one he loved would be caught in the tangle of religious nonsense. He wanted to liberate her from her Catholic shackles, and he rejoiced to see the day dawning when she, like him, would finally have no hesitation about rejecting the Catholic Church with all its superstitious rituals, its restrictive norms, and silly beliefs. And he would say years later, though from a totally different perspective, I tried to destroy her Catholic faith, and alas, I nearly succeeded. So what was the unexpected result that came out of Elizabeth's reading of the book by Renan? After all, Felix had hand-picked it from his anti-clerical library as the best book to finish off her Catholic faith. This so-called historical work had as its unspoken presuppositions the rejection of the very possibility of miracles, and even more so of any resurrection from the dead, basically a denial of the supernatural in the church, in the life of Christ, in the Christian life. Reading this triggered in Elizabeth a deep reaction. Instead of swallowing blindly the author's interpretations of Jesus and the early church, she realized that his arguments were inconsistent and did not hold water. And that realization provoked her to examine the foundations of Catholic beliefs from a more reliable source. Elizabeth Lesueur returned to the practice of the faith after about 2 years suspended, determined to ground her beliefs in the scriptures and in church teaching. She embarked upon a daunting program of self-formation in the faith, involving study of the Bible, fathers of the church, church history, the teachings of the popes and councils, and the great saints and sacred writers. She also discovered the great utility of philosophy for training the mind, and in general set about preparing herself to understand and defend the Catholic faith in all its breadth and depth. She adopted a regular program of prayer, meditation, and study, and sacramental participation, which she kept in a flexible way for the rest of her life. However, she was careful not to give her husband grounds for jealousy by leaving him to occupy herself in prayers and readings. She learned to do that in the hours when she was alone at home, so as not to leave him feeling jilted or abandoned. The intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation that she carried out systematically is all the more extraordinary in that she could not count upon the support or guidance of any academic institution, religious order, or apostolic movement in her life project. At that time, there was no such thing as a philosophical or theological education accessible to women, not even for religious women at that time, much less married women. In the Catholic world of her time, only seminarians and priests studied theology. Elizabeth consequently had to design her own curriculum, determine what matters she would study, search for resources, procure books, and find her own mentors. For the first years of her ambitious program of study, she had no one she could count on. She was really alone, relying on her own best judgment in her solitary pilgrimage. Her personal spiritual journal, now available in English, is an extraordinary record of Elizabeth's interior life in the years following her return to the faith. 5 or 6 years later, she found a spiritual director or a mentor, and in the last 4 years of her life, a spiritual sister. But in the meantime, Elizabeth undertook to study domains in which she had no guide. She went about acquiring the most solid Catholic books she could find. Soon, says one biographer, there were 2 libraries in their home. The anti-clerical one that Felix had accumulated, and then another of the best sources of Catholic doctrine and teaching that Elizabeth began acquiring. She had treatises of philosophy, scripture commentaries, fathers of the church, classics of spirituality, and the first 15 volumes of the 26-volume collection of the complete works of Francis de Sales. Believe me, she did not buy books to collect dust on the shelf. I'm sure she read those. Her purpose in this study was essentially apologetic at first, to defend her faith in the face of attacks or arguments against it, to learn how best to present the faith to those who doubt or do not believe, and to understand its inner logic. Felix was frustrated to discover that his challenges to her faith had actually led her to become not only more grounded in her beliefs, but also more fervent and serious in her Christian life. In her program of studies, he tells us, she read assiduously the New Testament and never passed a day without meditating upon some passage from it. She thus acquired a reasoned and substantial faith. In reflecting on his wife's life after her death, Felix recalled that she once wrote in a book of her younger sister, the maxim, "Every soul that uplifts itself uplifts the world." And Felix declared that in that short phrase, Elizabeth had defined herself. Indeed, as we have just seen, one of the most outstanding things of their married life was her self-uplifting, self-formation in the faith, in the virtues, and in a God-centered discipline of life. And all of this effort contributed to uplift her spouse through prayers, sacrifices, acts of kindness, and affectionate love, which would eventually attract him to God in her. She longed to spend time with Felix in an atmosphere of prayer, but his atheism did not allow that to happen. Nonetheless, she recognized that he was part of her solitude. It's a beautiful expression. It says, Felix is part of my solitude. That is, of her most intimate being and aspirations. The Lord gave her an ever greater love for him, whom she referred to as the one who is dear to me above all. Felix, personally and professionally, had a very busy social life, engaging in French colonial and foreign politics, writing for several different leftist or anti-clerical newspapers, mixing with a wide variety of professionals, politicians, journalists, doctors, scholars, writers, musicians, and artists who were generally not people of faith. He said that he often left the house after dinner to go to the office or to meetings, from which he would typically return at 1 or 2 a.m. But in all of Elizabeth's journal, we find no hint of complaint or accusation of his absence or late-night arrivals. It seems she had learned to fill her hours of solitude with intimate conversation with the Lord. So Elizabeth is an example of a married person living an active social life, fulfilling the multiple duties of her state, and at the same time living an intense Christian life in the path of conjugal holiness. In this path, she found a sure guide in St. Francis de Sales, who 3 centuries earlier had affirmed the lay and married vocation to holiness. Although she could not share this project with Felix, neither did she pursue it apart from him, but rather did it for him, and was sincerely united with him in every other way she could find. So she did not leave him behind in her search for God. Almost every one of her prayers includes Felix praying for the gift of faith. There they are. Elizabeth carefully integrated her family life and her spirituality. Felix and Elizabeth kept up a busy schedule of entertaining and cultural activities in Paris. She dressed beautifully and was an elegant hostess, as was expected in her station in life. They loved to receive guests and visit others, enrich their understanding and outlook by frequent travels to other European countries and further afield, where they appreciated the landscapes, cultures, art, language, music, and cuisine of each people. Elizabeth herself spoke various languages and was beginning to master Italian when she entered into her serious illness. They traveled widely until she was about 40, when her illness prevented long trips. They had built a summer home in the French countryside and participated fully in the joys and sorrows of the extended family. She would have been a wonderful mother had they been able to have children of their own, but they were not. As it was, she poured out all her love and attentions on her niece and nephews, her siblings, and most of all on her husband. She had a great gift of friendship, not only attested to by Felix, but also by dozens of people with whom she maintained correspondence, others whom she discreetly counseled, still others whom she helped with her resources in a hidden way. Her capacity for enriching relationships was shown above all by her deep and intense friendship with Sister Gobi, her soul friend. That was a nursing sister who became to her a spiritual sister, friend, and confidant. They only met twice in person, but they carried on a correspondence for 4 years. And Felix also was a friend of Sister Gobi's before and after the death of his wife. During the time she was limited to bed or recovering, many visitors came to see her. Felix had his doubts whether it would tire her out or negatively affect her health, but he also began to see that her many friends supported and encouraged her by their affection, prayers, and attentions. Madame Le Sueur was a charming and intelligent woman, never making a show of her intellectual gifts, but interesting, attractive, and spirited in conversation, always delightful and pleasant in her relationships, with a characteristic laugh that rang through the house. Felix wrote that she was very attractive, kind, amiable, and affectionate. For her part, rather than trying to change her husband's character, she focused on making herself more Christian to the marrow, she said. Thus Elizabeth sought to reach his heart through her joyous and affectionate relationship with him and her hidden life of prayer and sacrifices for his sake. She came to a vivid conviction that only God's grace could touch the depth of Felix's heart and bring about a conversion, Felix or anybody for that matter. She sought to prepare the ground for God's action in whatever way she could, little things, and rejoiced to see the tiniest signs of nobility in his behavior, openness to spiritual values, or chinks in the armor of his atheistic reasoning. After a few years of forming herself by both study and discipline of life, Elizabeth probably could have rebutted any arguments that Felix could put forward. He himself said that she was, quote, soon able to respond convincingly to anyone who would try to attack her faith. It sounds like he had personal experience of that. But Elizabeth understood that one who wins a battle may still lose the war in the process. That is, by being too strident in her relationship with Felix, by wanting to win arguments against him, she might harm or cause him to reject the quiet work of grace going on in his life, which only she perceived by her close attention to him. She was careful not to interfere with God's master work in the depths of his being. If she spoke openly about God too soon, she might interrupt the Spirit's gradual transformation of his heart, as of yet unknown to him, and the hearts of people like him, who were distrustful of anything connected with religion. She assumed the discipline of silence with her husband in regard to matters of faith, even though they were the most important things in her life, which she yearned to share with her husband, lest she provoke in him the spirit of obstinacy. She became increasingly convinced that arguments and discussions about religion with unbelievers would be of no profit to them, unaware as they were of the most profound spiritual dimension of the human person. She perceived that she could win no ground in her husband's soul by arguing against his unbelief. And not because of any intellectual inferiority or inability to argue on her part, but because of his closed mind. So she undertook a quiet and hidden apostolate of attractive love and tender affection towards her husband, the way marked out by St. Francis de Sales, together with sacrifices and prayers. But that didn't mean that her study was useless. It was not an anti-intellectual stance that she adopted. What began in her as a defensive reaction in a hostile context later became an intellectual apostolate, for which she recognized that God had gifted her. And that is why she committed herself to serious study as the cultivation of the mind. She sought to develop a real competence in each field she studied, not so that she could boast or impress her friends or pride herself on her achievements, but so that she could do some good by her understanding of the faith, the world, and the ways of God. Her object was to make Christian truth loved through her as a well-formed, articulate, and intelligent believer, and first of all, to make it loved by her beloved Felix. And what she willed for Felix with all her heart, she also desired for his like-minded colleagues. She wanted to be a good Samaritan to them in their state of spiritual prostration. She sought to make her home a place where people of diverse persuasions could congregate, and where she would make every effort to raise and enlighten her husband's and his friends' viewpoints. She wanted to allow others to see God in her without mentioning his name, a silent witness to God's love and truth. Precisely because of the great love they shared, the couple's opposing religious projects were a factor of tension and pain in their relationship, especially for Elizabeth, who wrote in her journal of the bitter suffering she experienced at hearing my faith and spiritual things mocked, attacked, and criticized by her husband and his friends during their social gatherings. In addition to this tension and the inability to have children, Elizabeth was plagued with a series of physical illnesses. As made explicit in her diaries, she endured all these crosses and became convinced that suffering is the highest form of action, the highest expression of the wonderful communion of saints, and that in suffering one is sure to be useful to others and to the great causes that one longs to serve. She considered it her great task, her mission before God, to work, to pray, and to suffer for Felix's conversion. She opened her horizons, too, to pray for the conversion of all those who did not have the gift of faith or who struggled to believe. This went on for many years, approximately 10, until it dawned on her that perhaps Felix would only receive the faith upon the sacrifice of her life. But if then she could be together with him in Christ for all eternity, she would accept in peace the renunciation of sharing the faith with him in this life which she so desired. She would offer her life for him, for his life in the Lord. And in fact, though he came to admire her inner strength in her last years as she suffered from cancer, and he intuited that it had something to do with her spiritual life, of which he knew very little. He never came around to the faith until after her death. A great blow she experienced in her later years was the death of her younger sister of TB at age 32. After that loss, she reflected upon suffering in the Christian life and viewed it in the light of Jesus' passion, considering it a great instrument of transformation of the believer in grace, something sometimes more powerful than words or actions. Between 1907 and 1908, Elizabeth's own health began to decline seriously. Liver trouble plagued her more and more, requiring her to give up travel and spend long hours resting in bed. Nevertheless, she continued to write letters on the interior life and to give counsel to different sorts of people who sought her out, but always discreetly, so as not to call the attention of or to bother Felix. In 1911, she was operated on to remove a malignant growth on one of her breasts. After surgery and radiation treatment, she was well for a couple of years, made a pilgrimage to Lourdes in 1912, accompanied by Felix. He didn't have faith in the Marian shrine, but he was concerned for his wife, who was weak. But the cancer recurred in early 1913 and spread throughout her body. 10 months before she died, prostrate in bed in the midst of great suffering, she wrote in her journal, "Lord, be thou blessed for my present suffering, because I dare to hope that it is the gentle answer of thy heart. I offer it all to thee, all of it, sufferings of body, heart, and soul, all my privations, my interior desolation, and my great spiritual solitude." She offered everything for her special intentions, first and foremost of which was her prayer for Felix's conversion. Elizabeth LeSueur died in the arms of her beloved, but still unbelieving, husband on May 3rd, 1914. The year after her death, in his grief, Felix was given her spiritual journal, which he had no knowledge of its existence. And in reading it, he was amazed to discover the intense and profound inner life of his wife. 2 years, I forgot to mention, 2 years before her death, the couple was talking one day about what each one would do if the other died first. And she said to Felix, "After I'm gone, you will come to the Lord. And since you don't do anything by halves, you will be a priest one day." And he said she was crazy. He had a sworn hatred of God. He would live in that and he would die in that. But a year after her death, with the grace of reading and discovering the whole hidden aspect of her life, he returned to the Catholic Church of his youth. He became a daily communicant, a Third Order Dominican. 2 years later, he published his wife's journal. Having received such positive impressions of it, it quickly became a bestseller, translated into all of the major European languages, and had sold 100,000 copies by 1930. 2 years later, he entered the Dominican order. His confessor had counseled against it because he thought it was the immoderate zeal of a recent convert. But he persisted, was accepted, and in the year 1923, at 62 years of age, he was ordained a priest, a Dominican. He spent much of his 27 years of Dominican priesthood. He had been married 25, and he was 27 years a priest, traveling across Europe, making known his wife's spirituality of lay holiness and promoting her cause of beatification. There's not time to talk about Felix's conversion. I've chosen Elizabeth's, which is more marked by the characteristics of St. Francis de Sales. But I would like to finish with 5 lessons to take home. First, the LeSueur's experience highlights the importance of a serious, well-rounded formation for Christian married life. We've seen the striking characteristics of Elizabeth's initiative and almost single-handed self-formation. But we would hope that in today's church, a generation after Vatican II, with a highlighted sense of the vocation of the laity, that couples would not be left to their own resources for a well-rounded Christian, pastoral, doctrinal, psychological formation. But my question is, where is it found? Where are the Catholic universities, the parishes, the apostolic movements on that score? Some things are being done, but they would have to be not in an academic rhythm, at a time and with the focus appropriate to people with secular jobs and family life. Second, Felix and Elizabeth both understood the importance of acquiring books for one's formation. They were both going in opposite directions, but accumulating books. And after Felix's conversion, or during it, the books Elizabeth had gathered served him greatly in his thought and personal conversion. Many families have extensive video or DVD libraries of entertainment of various sorts. But how many have Christian libraries with resources on the faith, be they books, dictionaries, videos, other media? My parents had a whole wall full of books, of scripture commentaries, liturgical books, philosophy, issues of justice and peace, and it was a wealth of resources that were open to any of their children to use. Third, Elizabeth longed to share her solitude in the Lord with the one she loved the most, but Felix's atheism at the time did not permit that. But I would say, how blessed are couples who have learned the art of conjugal prayer and of making retreats as couple. My parents, for over 15 years, were addicted to retreats at Wernersville at the Jesuit Retreat House. And my mother continued another 10 years after Dad's death. So putting one's Christian life in common through times of solitude is a great wealth that I think many couples have not yet discovered. 4, the LeSueurs offer a lesson about suffering in marriage. They came to understand suffering as contributing to one's own sanctification and the good of others. Suffering consciously accepted is a powerful means of grace in the conjugal relationship. Elizabeth first intuited it, later became convinced of it, and finally offered her life as a sacrifice for the conversion of her husband. Her suffering on many different levels of her being achieved extraordinary results in a very difficult marital situation. Felix, too, after her death, became convinced of the life-giving, transforming effects of Elizabeth's suffering, offered to God for his sake. The reality of the cross in family life is not sought, but accepted. When one of the spouses is attentive to and supports the other who suffers, it intensifies the Lord's blessings upon that family. Some of the beneficial effects of this spirituality of suffering may only be revealed after many years, even after the death of one of the spouses, as was the case with the Lesseurs. It can show the way forward to couples enduring chronic illness or disability of a spouse, couples with conjugal misunderstanding, and even intentional offenses. At the same time, Felix's tender support of his wife in her medical problems can encourage those wives and husbands who are the primary caregiver for their chronically ill spouses. And finally, in 1924, then Father Fulton Sheen, later Archbishop and famous Catholic radio and TV preacher, made a retreat under Father Felix Lesseur, in which he learned about Elizabeth, her spirituality, and his retreat director's conversion. And in his talks, later Archbishop Sheen frequently repeated the conversion story in many of his talks on marriage, in particular with regard to the role that spouses play in the sanctification of each other. And I ask, does this aspect, helping each other grow in holiness, find its place in marriage preparation programs, in wedding day homilies, and in marriage counseling? A best-selling book by a popular American Christian writer, Gary Thomas, entitled Sacred Marriage, maintains that marriage is more oriented to making spouses holy than to making them happy. But he says, don't get me wrong, it's not that marriage is designed to make you sad, but happiness is a byproduct of following one's Christian vocation. And so if a couple aims at being happy themselves, that's a trap. The key is to seek to live fully one's vocation, and then that will produce happiness in the couple. Thank you.